Assignment 4.1 Legal and Ethical Issues. BASES, also known as the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, are the professional body for all sport and exercise science experiments. BASES have a code of conduct that has to be referred to, and they guide the experiments for the practitioners and researchers and tell them what is acceptable and what is not acceptable throughout the experiment. If you are taking part in a sport and exercise science experiment, you have to make sure you use data protection, you have ethical clearance, informed consent, professional conduct, and you have to be competent in what you are doing. The Data Protection Act is used to control how your personal information that you have given to an organisation or business and how they intend to use it. Anyone who takes your data is responsible for the data you have given them, and they have to follow strict rules called the Data Protection Principles. If a business or organisation takes this data, they have to ensure that this information is used fairly and lawfully, used for limited, specific, stated purposes, not used excessively, that the information used is accurate, make sure that they do not hold on to the information of a person for longer than needed. It needs to be handled according to the people's data protection rights and kept safe and secure so that no one else can see or have access to the data. Obtaining informed consent is critical before starting an investigation or research, as without this the experiment would be unethical and illegal. Informed consent is potential participants' formal agreement to take part in a research project. This consent form must include everything that is planned to happen during the experiment so that the participants know exactly what they will be doing so they can decide if they are willing to take part in the research. One very important thing that has to be in the consent form is the right to withdraw. If they are not happy during the experiment, they can take themselves out of this situation. Legal and ethical issues are very important when taken on an experiment. If all the ethical and legal issues are not taken into consideration during the research, then the research should not take place. One main thing that researchers ensure that they have to ensure they have the right qualifications for the research in that field or the area that they are doing the experiment on. For example, if in an experiment you were taking someone's blood, you would have to prove that you had the right credentials to go forward with this procedure. The researchers need to live up to the reputation of sport and exercise science researchers. BASES are the most respected governing body in the industry. This reputation needs to be upheld by their researchers, and anyone who does not abide by their code of conduct can find themselves in a lot of trouble. If you do not abide by BASES code of conduct and decide to go against these rules, there are a list of different problems that can occur for not working ethically during an experiment. One example of an experiment that was ethically wrong was the Stanford prison experiment in 1971. They treated participants horribly and like real prisoners. They did not add in a right to withdraw to their consent form, so they could not leave if they did not want to take part in the research anymore. Due to faults like this in the past, BASES make sure that their research follows the code of conduct. However, those who choose not to follow this code of conduct will be sent to tribunal. This is a body established to settle certain types of dispute. So, for example, if a researcher did not get the participants to sign a consent form, they could be sent to tribunal to see if they're guilty of this. If they are, there are multiple different steps BASES could take. Firstly, you could end up with lawsuits from the participants themselves for the unethical work you have taken part in. This could then be led on further by BASES, as they could suspend you from any work in the current field or even expel you completely from the organisation, which stops you taking part in any sports science experiments. We are now on to scenario analysis. The first scenario is an investigation of the roles of cold vests in aiding recovery from maximal sprint intervals. This experiment could cause physical harm if the participant does not know enough about the test itself and the risk involved with the vest. This would be the fault of the researcher, as it is their job to tell the participants what they will be doing during the exercise. For example, the researcher took a group of 5 adults to use the vest but had not told them how cold the cold vest will be, and they may suffer from this, leading to trouble to the investigator. If this happens, they could end up in tribunal for causing harm to the participants, and depending on the seriousness of the injury, they could be suspended for further research. Then the next thing that could go wrong is that people's personal data could be released. Because of the Data Protection Act in 1998, they are not allowed to give out any of the participants' personal details. One way they could do this is by writing one of the 5 names of the adults on the board. This would exploit the rules and regulations of the Data Protection Act, as the investigator would be giving out the personal details of his clients to others in the group, which is strictly not allowed. This could result in a fine for the investigator and would give them a bad reputation as they could face further legal action depending on what happened. Another factor that could cause problems during this experiment is the consent of the participants. In a consent form, there has to be a description of the experiment and must also be a right to withdraw. For example, if there are 5 participants taking part in the experiment who does not feel like they want to continue with the testing, it is their right to stop whenever they want, even if it does ruin the test. However, if they do not abide by this rule, it can cause problems for the researcher. BASIS could get involved if the rule is broken, as it puts a bad name on sport and exercise science research and could ban a researcher from any further involvement with the experiment. The next scenario is the study of attitudes to obesity in primary school children during physical education lessons. The first problem with this study that could happen is psychological harm. For example, the obese children taking part in this activity could be the subject of bullying for their weight and may have the inability to take part in certain activities. It may also make the students feel bad about themselves talking about their weight, which is not what the researchers want. If this happens during the experiment, the researcher will be blamed for the psychological harm, as it is their experiment and they shouldn't allow anyone to be harmed throughout the experiment. This could cause legal action against the researcher, such as fines and further precautions such as bans from BASIS and possible expulsion. The next possible problem for this experiment is the equality. The students that are taking part in this experiment may feel that the test is unethical, as they are being singled out because of their weight. The parents of these children may also feel this is against ethical laws and could then sue the researcher for this test because of the equality warnings from BASIS. This would end in lawsuits and a warning from BASIS and maybe a further action if found guilty. The third problem with this experiment is that the students' data could be released, which is against the Data Protection Act. For example, they could accidentally give out personal details about the region that the student lives in. They could find themselves in a lot of trouble as they cannot give out information, as all the data they have on the students is confidential. As I said in the last slide, this could end in a bad reputation for the researchers. There may be further action, such as bans from further research in that field. The final problem with this is the consent of the children. The researcher has to ensure that the children have read the consent form and have agreed that everything in the form is okay, and they are happy to go forward with the experiment. They cannot go on with the experiment without signing this consent form, and if they do, they could be expelled from BASIS. The next scenario is the effect of punishment on performance of basketball free throw percentages. The first problem with this test is that it could cause physical harm. For example, if there is a group of 10 teenagers taking part in this experiment and for every free throw they miss they have to do 10 press-ups, this can cause physical harm to the participants, because if they are continuously doing these press-ups, it could end up harming their muscles from the strenuous work. This is a problem in any investigation. No one should be harmed in any way, and it is ethically wrong for people to be harmed in an experiment. If this ever occurs, the researcher could end up in legal trouble with fines and lawsuits. This can then go further with suspensions from BASIS. The next problem is that this kind of experiment could also psychologically harm the teenagers. For example, if it makes them afraid of missing a shot in basketball, which will then go on to affect their psychological state in the future during this exercise and basketball games, and could affect them in the future activity, which is unethical. Similarly to physical harm, they would be in legal trouble including a lawsuit and a ban from the current research, and could be suspended. The third problem with this experiment is that it could be deemed as an impractical test because of the punishment. The teenagers may feel they would be more motivated to score the free throws if they were rewarded for scoring instead of punished for missing, as everyone makes mistakes. They may feel that this is an unfair test to put them through that much physical strain, and it may not even motivate them to score their free throws, and it could just make them lose interest in the game. If they do not like the way the researcher has treated them, the researcher could be punished for an unfair test which is unethical. This would result in removal from that current test for the researcher and would not be able to be involved with the investigation. The final problem with this test is that there could be data protection issues. Just like the other two scenarios, the researcher is not allowed under any circumstances to give out the participants' personal details. For example, if they had held on to the personal information of the teenagers for longer than they needed to, the researcher could be in trouble with BASIS, as Data Protection Act states that you should only have the information for as long as necessary. If they hold on to the information for longer than needed, they could be removed from the research field. We are now on to the final scenario, the effects of interval training on blood lactate values. The first problem that this test could come with is the training level of the staff involved. For a test like this, where you'll be taking blood from the participants to test the effects of the training, the researcher and his staff have to be properly trained in this field of research and must prove this to the participants. For example, if they had a group of 8 adults, they would need to ensure that they were legally trained to deal with their blood and would have to prove this by showing them some kind of proof. If they are not trained and the participants find out about this, they can report them and they could end up in serious trouble. They would be sent to tribunal by BASIS to see if they were guilty of the charges. They would be suspended from BASIS until the result of the tribunal. If they were found guilty of this, they would be fined and banned from any further investigation in the sport and exercise science field. The next problem that could come across in this test is the consent of the participants. The researchers would have to ensure that everything that is planned in the experiment is in the consent form, so that the people taking part in the research know exactly what they will be doing. For example, it must be added in the consent form that they will need to take blood for the effects of interval training. They have to ensure that there is a right to withdraw in the consent form, so that at any time during the experiment, the subjects can drop out if they do not feel like it anymore. If either of these things are not input in the consent form, the researcher could find themselves with a fine and a possible ban from BASIS for breaking their code of conduct. The third problem with this test is data protection. They are not allowed to give out anyone's personal information, as the Data Protection Act is in place to stop this. So, for example, if the researchers shared the results of one of the subjects with the rest of the group, they would have problems with BASIS due to the fact they have been given out with protected information. This would affect the reputation of the researcher and would get suspended from BASIS. Depending on the seriousness, there would also be legal action taken against them from the subjects. That was my assignment 4.1 on legal and ethical issues. Thank you for watching.